Hey, Jordan, welcome to the Finance Diaries podcast. We are so happy to have you today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here and glad to have the opportunity to chat.
Really wanted to bring Jordan in as a guest today because Jordan has been my inspiration in the Quebec real estate investing process. For everyone that thinks that it is not possible to make money in real estate in Quebec, needs to meet my friend Jordan. We met quite a few years ago volunteering, and we've been following and inspiring each other throughout our real estate investing journeys. Jordan has hilarious tenant stories very regularly to provide me with that keeps lots of entertainment going in our conversations. And I wanted to bring him on here today to help inspire you who might be living in Quebec and feeling hopeless about the real estate investing possibilities. I know that it is very much possible to be done, not just possible to be done once, but replicated and to grow. So I want to hear everything, Jordan. What inspired you? What got you started? How did you buy your first property? And how did you grow to where you are now? Very loaded, long question.
I appreciate it. I'd say the same. You've also been an inspiration as well. I know you've been a lot more public about your journey, so it's been great to watch. It's been some motivation as well, a lot of tips there. So a little bit about myself. Many years ago, we're probably talking 2017, 2018. A friend of mine referred me a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which I feel like many of us have read or heard of. Read the book and immediately was like, I need to start buying properties and investing left and right. So him and I were looking at buying a place together to live in it. Long story short, didn't end up working out. He ended up moving to New York, and I stayed here. But kind of on that process, already started looking at condos. We were going to look at a condo for us to live in together, and then eventually rent it out and buy our own stuff. And see where that led. That road takes us. Ended up buying my first condo in 2019 here in Montreal to live in it. It was really kind of the starting point of it all, I'd say. Lived in it for probably about 4 years before I decided to rent it out, which we could touch upon in a bit. But that was really the starting point. I think reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, buying the condo was kind of that first step into the journey of kind of how this all works. I think I've always had an inspiration to become my own business owner at some point, and I kind of said, this is probably one of I guess the ideas that I don't need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. I don't need a new product or idea. It's something that's been there and it'll continue to be around. I just have to make sure that my numbers work out. And so when I bought the condo, I think I was quite interested in the idea of real estate as a whole. I remember looking left and right at different things. I spent probably a good 2 years of just reading, researching any article, you name it. And I think, like many people, like you mentioned, the Montreal market is very competitive, very expensive. It's definitely hard for someone just starting out to get into it. Um, I looked at, you name it, properties that weren't making a dollar, trying to figure out, how do people do it, and ended up initially buying one condo pre-development. I said, okay, maybe this will be my kind of, foot in the door here. I have the cash flow now to do it, and in 5-10 years, whatever it is, it'll appreciate and I'll sell it. Ended up buying a second one. Started this about a year and a half ago now, and I kind of quickly realized that if I just leave the city of Montreal, the opportunities are a lot bigger. There's a lot more opportunities. The price drops off considerably, and I think that was kind of the first realization I had was, the condos are nice, but at the end of the day, it's only when I sell that it's really going to bring in the real money, and it's not going to be the day-to-day revenue that I was looking for. Ended up selling one of those two condos already, trying to sell the second one. So if anyone's looking for a condo in Montreal, I have an option for you there. But July 1st, 2022, bought my first triplex outside of Montreal. That was kind of the first things I looked at is, where can I go that I can afford something? And I kind of said, as far as I have to go, I'll go. I looked outside of Montreal. That was kind of the first thing I did. It was definitely a process. It was, I think, real when going into these properties and seeing how bad some of these can be. The first one, I had an accepted offer on a fourplex. Had absolutely no clue about the area. It was a small town here in Quebec. Had absolutely no clue. I had fortunately a colleague that I worked with at the time who gave me some tips and tricks. And he was mentioning that, everyone in that part of the town is on BS, which is a French term for bien social, which means welfare. But, like an Anglo that I am, I thought BS means bullshit. Hopefully we can swear on here. And I just thought, it's a town full of BSers. I said, okay, I can handle BSers, no problem, right? I could deal with their nonsense. And I remember telling my dad one day, I said, yeah, he said, everyone on there is on BS. He says, you better ask him if BS is bien social, which is welfare, and not a BSer. And I remember texting him, I said, what does BS stand for? And he says, it's welfare. I said, well, that's not good. I'm not looking to inherit tenants on welfare because that's problematic. And that was kind of my intro into kind of real estate. I realized that, many brokers are just there to sell you whatever. They really don't care. It was a lot of learning, and very quickly had accepted offer on that fourplex. Two of the units were vacant because they're vacant, and there were squatters that were living in there. They absolutely wrecked the place. One of the units, the guy couldn't get out of bed, so he had a dog. He was never able to take his dog out, so the dog was just peeing and pooing all over the unit. One woman, I think we should call child services for her child, child protection services for her child. It was a mess. And so I'm looking at them and just saying, like, I just didn't have a good feeling. It was a husband and wife. The husband had, I think, mental issues and disappeared. He wasn't reachable for weeks at a time. And I'm like, what's going on here, right? Like, are they trying to sell? I can't reach the guy. Like, forget it. So we ended up walking away from that. I ended up walking away from that one. Kind of took it as a learning experience to, understand what BS is. And July 1st, 2022, bought the first triplex. It was a good experience because two of the units were empty when I bought it. So that kind of allowed me to kind of renovate right away. They were pretty bad shape. Again, I think a bit of my own, I guess, lack of knowledge, maybe ignorance. I didn't realize the area was a bit rougher than I thought it was, which I guess was good because I invested. Otherwise, I probably would have been too hesitant and sitting on the sidelines too much. Bought in, I didn't realize right across the street there's, homeless people and kind of old gang members that just sit across the street, which is a little nerve wracking. But literally first day got in, I remember I was already hacking away. I said, with two of the three units vacant and one tenant paying about 50% of the mortgage, I said, I can't waste any time renovating or getting new tenants in. So I didn't have, plans for renovations. I didn't have a contractor. I had nothing. I just showed up and I'm starting to hack away at this place. I said, I'm not very good with my hands, but anyone can do demolition work. I figured if I go too far, they'll just put some walls back up and whatever happens, happens. And literally it was the next day when we bought it. The next day I'm already there hacking away. The selling broker shows up to the door. He's got all his documents in hand and he sees behind me I've already ripped down the whole kitchen. And he goes, you don't waste any time. And, I'm relatively new to this. I said, I can't afford to. I'm losing 50%, 50% of the mortgage. I got to cover myself every month. So renovated the whole thing. It was a pretty bad shape, the triplex. Again, I think it was that learning experience of, what good shape is, what decent shape is, and what bad shape is. And unfortunately, this was in pretty rough shape. And so it was a good learning experience in the sense that I jokingly say I recreated the Ritz-Carlton of the area here, this tiny little town in Quebec, and it doesn't need it, unfortunately. So I learned what not to do in renovations. But on the other hand, I think I realized what to look for in a property, how to properly renovate so I'm not going all out. And essentially how I did it, when I bought my condo in Griffintown here in Montreal, I put a hefty down payment on it, which allowed me to borrow against the condo using a line of credit, and I used that to fund my renos. And fast forward a year and a half later, this Friday, I'll be closing on the sixplex, so it'll put me at 16 doors in about a year and a half. So it was a very aggressive year, a lot of high stress, a lot of moving pieces, but I think that was the biggest takeaway there was looking outside the city allowed me to kind of expand and grow and expand, and the goal is to continue in that direction. So that's kind of the brief intro right there.
It almost sounds like the ignorance that you had about the areas is what propelled you forward, which is kind of in a way terrible, but also a really good thing. But I think it helped prevent your analysis paralysis because you were just essentially like, oh, this is a great deal, and then made it work. And I'm glad that you mentioned about over renovating. It's something I've spoken about in the past, and just like some neighborhoods don't pay more for the quartz countertops and the beautiful hardwood floors or the herringbone floors even. Some areas are just not for it, and Jordan is a landlord in areas. Everyone needs to live somewhere, right? It doesn't have to be the nicest place ever. It doesn't have to be the highest rent ever. But everyone needs a landlord. I have can absolutely vouch for some of the situations Jordan's been through. One of my favorite ones was that he actually purchased a furnished condo as an Airbnb
Yep.
and used the photos from that property from before he'd even closed to post it on Airbnb, and he had bookings for the day after his closing date, which was absolutely wild to me. But you can tell that Jordan is not very scared of risk, and probably having that a bit of like ignorance is bliss side of things. Like you have the I'll do it and I'll make it work, like the mentality of don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And I think that that has been a huge asset for you as an investor, like to be able to do all of these things. So I do have a couple questions other than congratulating you on all
Thank
of
you.
that.
Thank you. I forgot about that story. I've had, unfortunately, many other horror stories in that Airbnb. That was one of few.
So definitely lessons learned for sure, and we like to share our lessons with each other, which again is the point of the Finance Diaries. We're always trying to help each other out. If you have any Airbnb questions, we're glad to help you with that. I did have a question. I know that you mentioned about your condo and how you wanted to start, and I don't even think that we ever really talked about this. I do recall we had a conversation in Cosmos about real estate investing, probably just when you were starting all of this. I think this was like August of last year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I never asked you. So the condo, was that initially meant to be a primary residence, or did you always have it in your head that it was going to become a rental?
I think I was always open to both. I think, I realized I wasn't going to live in there forever, right? I didn't know how long specifically I'd want to live in there, but I always knew that, I'd move on from it eventually. So I was never super attached to it as much as I loved, living in there and being there. I think I was never super attached to it in that sense that I was always, able to, if the right opportunity came about, I would jump on it. And I think that's where I lived in it for about almost 4 years, and at a certain point, the mortgage versus kind of the rental market, there was such a big gap that it made sense for me to move out and take advantage of it. That I kind of said, let's do that. I think initially the plan was to pay it down enough and then use that to buy a home one day. Still might be the case, but I think I kind of went into it saying, let's live in here for now and go from there and kind of decide later on. But I think looking back, I'd probably take the option of kind of renting and then use that money to buy on the side, because obviously it was a big down payment to live in it myself. And I think that's where it was kind of restrictive at first. I was able to borrow against it, and that kind of allowed to fund a lot of these projects. But I think I kind of went into it saying something will come from this, whether I sell it, rent it out, etc. But I never really had a plan necessarily going into it.
So your options were open. That's always good. I know that I want to address this because it's something I often hear from people is that they feel like because they didn't buy their first place being like a duplex or a triplex that they live in, that because they bought a primary that they're not able to invest in real estate now. And as you can hear from Jordan, that's not true. It's fully doable. And then it gave you a great amount of equity to be able to pull out to do your renovations. And then I guess, did you refinance and pay yourself back on those properties? I know that for some of them you might have. Do you want to elaborate a bit on how you continued to grow, like how you went
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
first one to the 16th one?
yeah. So essentially, I'm in the process of refinancing the triplex now, which was the first real one that I bought about a year and a half later now. So that'll be kind of allowing to kind of fund, kind of almost playing catch up here is what I've basically been doing. Essentially, when I bought a triplex, a fourplex, a sixplex is kind of the main ones, and then Airbnb and some condos prior. Essentially, I was able to sell one of the condos I bought pre-development shortly after it was delivered to me, and basically took that down payment, put it towards the fourplex. So I was able to do that. I had still a decent amount on the line of credit. So it's obviously a high risk, high reward. I don't suggest it for everyone, but essentially took most of the line of credit, used that as a down payment for the sixplex, refinancing the triplex, which will then pay back the sixplex. So it's obviously a bit of hard to follow and keep up with, but essentially it's been a bit of refinancing, borrowing against the line of credit, and kind of continuing that rinse and repeat. I think the biggest thing is you got to be comfortable with risk and risk management. I think don't go crazy and take out the whole line of credit and find out you can't make those payments. It's obviously extremely calculated, extremely stressful too. A lot kind of had to fall in place at the right time to make sure everything moves smoothly. But it's essentially looking at it and saying, I guess no one could have predicted interest rates shooting up like they did, but looking at, what are the current payments, how much can I stomach and how much can I handle, and using that line of credit as leverage to buy more, and essentially saying, if, I don't know, my line of credit's at, let's say 7%, as long as I can handle that amount, even if I'm just paying the interest only to kind of fund the rest and pay it back eventually, then I can continue moving forward. And of course, there's a risk with it. And I think it's everyone's judgment to see how much risk they can handle and how much they can leverage themselves. I don't suggest, over leveraging yourself, especially now. But that was essentially what I did, was saying, I can handle this much on the line of credit. It'll allow me to buy this property. It'll generate this amount in cash. I can refinance it at a certain point, pay it back down, and kind of keep fluctuating with that and allowing that as leverage to keep going out and buying, essentially.
So you're really looking at investing constantly in places that you can add value to be able to refinance. I'm curious if you feel comfortable discussing. I hope you do. How exactly? So were you buying on fixed rates? Were you buying on variable rates? Were you refinancing on fixed? How are you doing these to be able to refinance later down the line? Were you just paying penalties to break them, or?
Essentially, yeah. Essentially, yes. The triplex was probably the most costly in the sense that the rate I had on the triplex was about 3.5%. But I basically said 3.5%, and you throw on, we're looking at about 100,000. We're gonna be able to pull out of it at about 6-ish%. It comes to about 4.5% total. So I kind of said, with the current rates, it's really not that bad. And then anything I'm refinancing now, the rate I had going in versus the rate I'm going to have when I refinance is not much different. I think that's one thing I'd love to say is, everyone gets scared about interest rates rising, and yes, it is a concerning thing, and yes, it is scary. I think if we look at the difference between 5 to 5.5%, and even 5 to 6, 6 to 7, it's not as big as people think. It's obviously scary, and obviously your payments go up, but it's not a crazy amount that it should be a deal breaker. And I think that's where, when you start to look at the difference between 5 to 5.5, it's not really going to change your life, right?
Yeah.
So that's where, when I was refinancing, it wasn't such a big difference because I bought it pretty recently.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So were you giving yourself like a timeline on those renos? I know you're saying you just are refinancing your triplex now, but after that first lesson that you learned, what do you look for? How long of a refinance period do you ideally want to have? Or are you just going to stick with the higher rates until they get lower again? What's your plan with the new sixplex and everything else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the first renos took forever. I thought, in 2 months max they'd be done. I think they took about 6 months total, so significantly longer. So that was probably the first learning experience. Um, in terms of refinancing now versus waiting, I think it becomes that question of when, right? I think we all know it at some point it's going to happen, but I think at the same time, it's ultimately just the cost of opportunity, right? And I guess in my personal preference, I'd rather have the money available, whether it's on a line of credit or actual cash, to be able to invest on the next one, versus wait till rates drop and then go from there. So the goal would be to refinance probably within 4 to 6 months going forward. Try to find ways to just add value pretty quickly, and then refinance right away. I'd rather have kind of the cash on hand ready to go versus do it backwards of find a property, find the cash, might have to refinance. That'll take time and just make it that much more difficult to buy a property going forward.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And sorry, I have so many questions as you're speaking that I apparently don't ask you in our hilarious voice note text message conversations. Whenever I have a voice note from Jordan, I know I'm gonna laugh, so I need to be ready for it. I need to like not be taking a sip of a drink. I'd have to try find one that I anyway. The probably the funniest one was the Airbnb one, but I did want to ask you a few things. So I'm going to try to remember all of them. But the first one I wanted to ask you was what made you have the pivot? So you had a triplex and a fourplex. I know that some of the listeners here call it a triplex. Regardless, what made you go from the, I guess, more like smaller multifamily into commercial, which would be a 6 unit? Was it just like an opportunity, or were you actively looking for bigger than 5 units? Like, how did that transition happen?
So I think the intention was always to go bigger and bigger. I didn't want to go from, 2 to 20 and then I'm going to say, I need a full-time maintenance and a janitor and everything that I just didn't have. So I didn't want to go too fast and grow too fast to the point that the structure wasn't there that I could support these buildings, not from a financial perspective, but from the operational day-to-day side of things was my bigger concern. So I was going progressively bigger as the opportunities presented themselves. It was ironic because when I was buying the fourplex, uh, it was zoned as a triplex, and we had to work on getting it rezoned as a fourplex before I was going to take ownership. I was presented with the opportunity to buy a sixplex basically at the same time, and so I said, "Well, why not? Sure, let's do it." And with the way it worked out, I almost closed on the six before the four. But even when I was going through the process, I kind of said like, this four is already too small. I can go straight to the six. Um, so I think the first thing I realized is it's not as big as you think, and that's probably what I've told myself when I was starting: is either save up more money, build a partnership, and go bigger, as big as you can. You'll figure out a way. You'll find a way. But the other thing was everything that I financed so far has been on the personal side. So RBC has been a great lender in that regard. Shout out RBC. Uh, you're able to finance up to 6 units, no problem, on the personal side. So I was able to do that because when you're getting into kind of commercial loans, it requires a much bigger down payment, or you have to start going to different types of lenders for more creative financing. So I was trying to stay away from that as long as I could, just because I knew the residential side was a lot more clear. I knew what I'm getting into. The commercial side, there's a bit more kind of calculations required in terms of what down payment is needed. It wasn't always the same cookie cutter amount. If you start to go to kind of those alternative lenders, it becomes a bit more standardized. But my intention was to stay on the residential as long as I could. That sixplex I'm buying now is probably the last on the residential side, so it's kind of forcing me up to the commercial side now. But I think, again, as I was kind of on this journey and learning, I realized there's a lot more benefit to that commercial side. Oftentimes sellers are a lot more open to that seller financing. They're realizing it's a lot more common and a lot more, a bit of a necessity to kind of help make a deal happen. It's obviously tougher now with higher interest rates, but there's a lot more of that creativity aspect I found. And the other one, which I'm kind of slowly kind of learning again, just taking it left and right here, but CMHC is obviously a major one that, from what I've kind of started to realize, is a lot of major real estate investors are heavily leveraging CMHC financing, whether it's the standard CMHC or the new program they just released, the MLI Select, which is extremely favorable. But of course, it kind of has its perks, right? I think with everything, it's kind of there's trade offs. So I think that's what I'm starting to look into now is being able to tap into the CMHC as much as possible. Their amortization terms are a lot longer, so it's obviously dropping my payments. I'm paying down less equity, but I've kind of looked at it as I'm not so much focused on the equity aspect right now. I'm more focused on the cash flow. If I sell it, then I don't have as much equity. Hopefully, the price went up when I sell it, and that's where I'll make my difference. But it was really kind of from a day to day operational standpoint, when you kind of go to that 5+ units on the commercial side, the CMHC offers a lot of opportunities that standard banks just can't compete with. And so it makes it, from a day to day cash flow, a lot more attractive.
Yeah, and for anyone who's maybe got a little bit lost there, um, there
I realize that
there's
was a
a lot of
long-winded answer.
technicalities to changing from. So in Canada, if you're not listening from Canada, everything above 5 units is considered to be a commercial property. And just in general, with buying your 5% down, 10% down first property that you're able to do, you can actually the reason there's more competition in everything that's below a fourplex is that you can still use your CMHC down payment with those and live in it. And so there's a lot more competition in those. And as Jordan is mentioning, it becomes a bit harder and less people are interested in the market of bigger units, even though I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is probably interested in those bigger units. And it is a definite step, but that's where they start to look at, or can start to look at, um, debt service instead of debt to income. So that means debt to income is like what you're making versus what kind of things you're generating. So right now, that's my like the way that my properties, my duplex, everything that's been looked at is how much money is Stephanie making, how much money are her properties making, and how much debt does she have between her properties. Versus when you move into debt service, it's really how a property carries itself. So, how much is it generating? How much are you paying? Does it cover everything relating to it expense wise? They still kind of take into consideration things like your personal credit score and things like that, but they're not looking really at all, I don't even think, at your other assets in that case. So that's where it's an interesting opportunity to move into a different market. If you feel like maybe your current properties might not be making a ton of money, maybe your cash flow is even negative and you're just waiting for that appreciation, you're waiting for interest rates to come down or refinance, pivoting into the commercial side, there could be a lot of reasons for it, but also like that bigger growth. I did want to ask you something else that I know the
Maybe if I can, just before you ask that, what I can
yeah.
add as well is on the commercial side, when you go to that refinance process, they're really, really just looking at building financials and less so of the aesthetic side. One mortgage broker specifically told me as long as there's a roof over their head, that's fine. And they're just looking at, money coming in and money going. They're not looking at the aesthetics. Is it nice? Is it not? They don't care.
Wow.
And so that's where it's pretty appealing, because the second you get a signed lease with an increase, you can already go to the bank and refinance. So you don't even need to wait for that cash to come in. You can refinance a lot quicker. You really don't need to do much work to the building, and it just makes it that much easier. Where obviously on the residential side, they start to look at, comparables, the aesthetics, the work done. I don't want to say it's more subjective. Obviously, there's, formulas and pros and cons to both sides, but you don't need to invest as much on the reno side if you're able to just increase the rental value of the property.
That's really cool to know. Do they take into consideration things like how old the roof is or like how old things are? It's just like, okay, that's the lease.
Barely.
Okay.
So the
Wow.
one thing, obviously, when you're tapping into the CMHC, it's, Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation. And so the one thing that I've heard, and fortunately I haven't been on the bad side of this, is they will kind of do a brief check on you. They'll research your name. And, if you're showing up in the news for, rent evicting, kicking people out, etc., they will not finance you. Right. So you got to make sure you're doing it in a proper way. If they get, the slightest hint that that was the case, it makes your life tougher, right? And
Yeah,
so that's where you got to be mindful of kind of how you do it, depending which, agent services, your ticket, your case, you might be different. But from what I've kind of heard and gathered is, if they start to get wind that that's how you're going about increasing rental value, they won't finance you.
right. That's why we have Jordan here, the friendly landlord, friendly CMHC landlord who's not doing that. Um, so something that you mentioned that I know the answer to that I think a lot of people will be really interested to know is, do you self-manage your properties? Do you self-manage all 16 doors?
I do. It's a task and it's not, right? I think the one thing I look at it, and I know my mom gets mad at me for this, is I call my tenants my employees, and not in a bad way by any means. But I think if you're not looking at it that way, you're missing something. And I think in every single building, and I guess fortunately, the bigger the building, the easier it gets because you have more candidates, is they all have something to add, right? I won't necessarily go to a doctor or an engineer with a high paying job and say, can you help out around the building? I'll give you a couple bucks. It's probably slightly disrespectful, if anything. And that's kind of what my mom got mad at me for. But, I don't want to, say that there's always someone who could need a few extra bucks. But I think in every building, there's oftentimes someone that's willing to help out. And, they can really be your eyes and ears for the property. And it's on two separate buildings now where I've had been able to get a tenant for peanuts, about $100 a month. They'll take the grass, they'll cut the grass, they'll take the garbage out, they'll clean the hallways of the common areas. $150 a month. They'll be able to do a lot of that and kind of notify me if anything is a little strange, if they're hearing things, etc. That it just saves the cost of a property manager. So I've always taken that approach, and that's why I found with bigger buildings, you have more tenants you can approach, and it makes it easier to kind of just find one, right? It really only takes one that's going to be willing to do it, and it makes it all that much easier, right? You save the money of a property management fee. I have nothing against them. At a certain point, it's needed. I'd personally rather bring that expertise in house, so I don't need to kind of pay for it, and I can have a kind of a closer, grip on what's going on. But until then, if I can pay someone 100, $150 a month to do all the basic tasks around the building, it's essentially the same as what I'd get from a property manager. And as long as you have, one or two handymen on call that you can trust and you can know you can go to them, it solves most of your problems, right? I think handymen are a dime a dozen. There's so many. It takes one or two good ones, but if you could find those, I know I can't fix this myself, right? So either I'm calling them, and if the property management company is calling their handyman or they're calling someone, we're both calling someone to do the same job. So I'd rather do it myself and save the 5% a month versus having them do it and end up at the same result.
Yeah, and I think that that's also a good point that you mentioned is that it's not just, I mean, nothing to property managers. I think a lot of people do need property managers because they really just want to get the check and that's it and don't want to hear anything else. But in this case, it's actually better than a property manager because are you referring to them as superintendents kind of? Or not really, unofficially?
I haven't gone into the formalities of giving them titles yet and annual reviews and raises yet.
Okay. Well, let's call them
But essentially, yeah,
superintendents for the sake of,
essentially a superintendent for the building.
because like the advantage I'm seeing here is that, like you said, they're your eyes and ears. A property manager might not ever really visit a building other than for turnovers. And I'm just thinking like of a few cases that you said that someone let you know that someone had two dogs that didn't have a dog on their lease, or like about things that happen in the hallway, or someone parking in the wrong spot. And obviously, yes, don't bug your landlord with everything minor, but so this barking, howling duo of dogs, someone let Jordan know, which how would a property manager have ever even known that? And so I think that that is a really good advantage that you spun there, is that you use someone in house that could probably use a break on the rent, and that at the same time like is proud of where they live, they want to take care of where they live, and they want like to have a pleasant living experience themselves. I think that's where sometimes property managers, and not to speak ill of property managers, but just where you lose a bit of the touch with reality because it's not really their problem at the end of the day. Like they don't have to
Right.
live with the barking dogs, or they don't
Yep.
care about the car that's always
Yep.
parked in the wrong spot. So that's a really good way of using your resources. That's awesome. 16
I
dogs.
found
Wow.
I found when I was buying the fourplex, actually, and we were doing one of the first visits, it was the property manager with the selling broker that brought the keys to open the place up. And we show up, there's no lights at the front door, they're just missing the bulbs. We're checking on one of the units, and the tenant says, my sink's been leaking been leaking. And I'm just standing next to the property manager, and I'm watching this saying, aren't you supposed to manage the building? I'm just watching this unfold here. And he doesn't say, he just says, okay, we'll take care of it. So I said, how long has it been leaking for? And he goes, months. And I just turn to the guy, look at him, and I say nothing, right? In my head, I go, what are they paying you for? They're
Yeah.
paying you every single month. And this has
Wow.
been clearly leaking, and you have absolutely no clue. And I think that's where I kind of said, I'd rather bring this expertise and this service in house so I could have a bit more of a control on it
Yeah.
and have, I would hope my tenants
That's
call me if
true, the
something's
element
leaking.
of
But
control as well. And a sink
yeah,
leaking, gosh, that's one of the easiest things to fix in a property. Would have taken 5 minutes.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good aspect as well, the control of it. I don't know if you're at the point yet that you have like forms and stuff that people need to fill out, but I did want to ask you, sorry, I want to go all the way back. I know that you mentioned it at the beginning because I don't know if you remember how I almost became a landlord to one of the kind of properties you were describing at the beginning with the welfare and everything. I do want to mention that I think that when I was visiting this property, I had visited a property just about an hour outside of Montreal, and I had, if everyone remembers this property, I had an accepted offer at $163,000. It was making 2,200 a month, which is actually nuts. And at the time, interest rates were also like 1.5%, so extra nuts. But the one thing that the owner had told me about the building was that he said the thing is with people tend to get scared of buildings that have people with welfare in it, but you also know that they're the ones that do not want to get kicked out because they know they're going to have such a hard time finding another unit, and they will be the building before the building with the doctors and the lawyers and everyone that will pay you on time every month. So that's just one thing. If ever you're considering getting a building that has tenants who are on their BS, do keep that in mind, that it's an opportunity to continue to house people affordably and to still potentially make crazy, because this was a fourplex. 163 was just because it was in a bad part of town, but it still made money, and these tenants were still paying like very reasonable rents. And anyways, that was just one point I wanted to bring up. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I know with your Airbnb, that was a joint venture. Is that the only joint venture you had, or you did the rest of them on your own?
Just the Airbnb. Yeah, the Airbnb was the only one I did on my own for now. I'm kind of realizing and seeing again to really kind of grow and expand at a rate that I'd like to, which is probably, I was hopeful I could probably try to buy one more this year. It's probably looking unlikely now. The goal for next year is probably to double this year, so about 30 to 40 units total next year. Uh, I'm realizing it gets to a point though where some form of external funds would need to kind of come into play, whether it's a partnership, whether it's private lenders and then paying them back. Definitely something of that regard to help expedite it, just because of, I guess, the rate that I want to scale at requires some of that. um, but I think for now, I'm still going to refinance the fourplex, the sixplex. That should kind of generate some cash to kind of build out or buy out the next one, pay off everything else. But it probably will need to start looking at some sort of partnership model. It's tricky because you got to find someone with like-minded interests and that you can count on. And I think the biggest thing is, what they always say is complement where your weaknesses are. I think that's the biggest thing. Is we always look at friends, but it might not necessarily be the best option. And so that's where probably we'll start to look at it. I've kind of been planting the seeds here and there of kind of presenting or kind of just mentioning some opportunities and what I'm working on, and kind of just having people in mind. I think it's one thing to have people in mind. I guess I'll see the level of seriousness when push comes to shove and I'm asking them for money or to join in. But for now, it's basically only been myself. But I guess we'll see how that starts to evolve.
Yeah, so you kind of answered my next question. This was my last question. I wanted to ask, like, what does the future look like for you? I know you kind of just said that you want to double or more than double the amount of units that you have. Are you looking at continuing to grow? Is there an amount of units you want to hit? Is there a cash flow you want to hit? Are you trying to just pay them off all off and collect purely cash flow? What is next for you, Jordan?
I mean, if you can't tell, I clearly enjoy stress as much as I say I hate it. To double all this myself adds a lot of stress, but I'd say, a while back, it was kind of just, grow and figure it out as I go. I think I'm starting to be a bit more structured now. I think I've had the time, the back half of this year to start building out that structure to allow myself to start buying bigger properties. I kind of said, if I want to go bigger, I need to have the structure in place now, because if I try to do it as I'm buying a bigger property, it's just going to be a mess. I don't think there's necessarily a goal in mind. I think the ultimate goal is to walk away from, well, I guess the first goal is to walk away from the day job and be able to do this full time and not need to worry about, a salary or an income and anything of that nature. That's probably the first goal. I think the next goal is then, just financial, like real financial stability of, if I never were to buy another property today, I can comfortably live and I can comfortably have money set aside is probably the next goal. So I never really had a number in terms of, doors, properties, etc. I think the ambitious goal I'd say is probably keep doubling every year for now. Obviously, at a certain point, that'll start to get difficult. But the goal next year, how I've kind of structured it is, 30 to 40 doors, looking at about properties that are about 8 to 12, 18, 8 to 13 units. Start with that. And I kind of said to myself, it only really takes two, right? If I can get two next year, I could do it in January. I could do it, all the way in December. I'm really only going after two properties. And so when I kind of break it down that way, it's a lot more easier to manage. I kind of a bit more zoned in on what I'm looking for, and I'm less so all over the place. I think the intention is to kind of go bigger than the last one. Eventually, it's not bad to kind of go a bit smaller, but ideally around 8 units. 8 to 13 is kind of the goal. My thinking is at about 20 units, I start to kind of need full-time staff, which I don't want to get into just yet, just because it's just that layer of complexity and structure that's not, in my day-to-day just yet. So I'd say about 8 to 13 units on the next property or the next two properties. And if I can do that, I've basically doubled what I've done this year. And so that's kind of the goal is I just got to find two properties next year. And if I do more, it's great. But if not, I think to double from this year in 2 years, go from 0 to 40 doors, it's a pretty good trajectory in my books.
Yeah, that's very awesome. I would say ambitious, but looking at you, you don't, that's not ambitious at all for you. That's really awesome. I think that that's a good way to look at it is that it's not, I think that's what people need to keep in mind is it doesn't matter how many doors because you can have one door making $1,000 a month cash flow and you can have 10 doors making $1,000 a month cash flow. So yeah, I like the idea of looking at bigger buildings. That's kind of logical way for you to move. I am curious though, for your staff that you want to bring on, what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of like an acquisition manager? Are you thinking like of a handyman on your payroll? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably, I guess the handyman is probably the first one I'd go to. I have a guy that does a lot of the leasings for me. I think the one thing that I've realized is kind of that time value of money. I could do these leasings myself. I could pay a guy also, half a month's rent, and he'll do it himself, right? And so I think that's where I started to realize the power and the benefit of delegating and how much value add it gives to me. So I have a guy that does the leasings for me. I've kind of checked off that box. Even if he doesn't work for me, it's no problem there. So I've kind of checked off that box. I'd say the in-house handyman is probably the first one I'd go to. I'd also want to do it at a point where I could make sure that there's enough work for him. The intention would be, he's working exclusively for me, and so that's where it's still a bit of a balance of at what point is that needed. If I kind of look at, calls I get every month for service calls, obviously it's a small portfolio. Maybe I'm just lucky, but there hasn't been enough to really warrant having someone. If I were to take this amount and multiply it by 4 or 5x, I can't really justify having someone. So it's still a question of at what point does that become a necessity? In the bigger buildings, again, it's also a question of, it might be a little too much to ask one tenant to start mopping the hallways and floors for a 8, 10, 12, 15 unit building. It starts to become a little much. So it's probably that janitor handyman is probably the first one. It's really kind of a question of at what point can I justify it so that, I always look at it as if I'm hiring someone and bringing someone on, I'm taking them out of their current job. And, I don't want to make that mistake of hiring them and realize there's not enough work for them. Right. So it's something that I always want to look at carefully and make sure that I could justify them having to leave their current job so that, they can now join me and have sufficient work and not need to turn around and say, sorry for taking you out of your job. I don't have enough for you. Just go back to where you were. Right.
I
So
I
I think
actually
I'm
have
always
I
mindful of
heard
that.
something on bigger pockets at one point that was quite interesting that might help you out here. Someone was saying that they were pretty much like they had the same conflict as you. Is like at what point do I bring someone on full time? And what they found out from another friend that invested was that they would get a specific handyman that they really liked and that they wanted to be readily available. And what they did was that they paid this handyman, I don't remember if I told you this, they paid this handyman like a retainer of, let's say, like $200 a month or whatever amount, so that when they call, and they had like a contract for this, that when they call, that this handyman would go to them like first. So not
That's great.
specifically on your payroll, kind of in a way, yes, but at the same time, like, you have a contractual obligation to like come help me within like 1 to 2 days. Like, maybe you're stuck in something right now, you don't have to drop everything and run, but that amount kept the handyman like keeping your number on like top of line, like you're off the do not disturb list, that you're
That's
there.
great. I like that one
And
actually.
that could be something that you look for as you move forward. That's what I'm considering doing at this point as well. So just a little tip that I heard that might help you and someone
That's
else
very
listening
good.
to this podcast. Could be a good way to start, and then eventually maybe they'll want to come work for you full time when you get to your 100 units.
That's great advice, though. That's really
Yeah.
good advice.
Well, that's what we do here, is we learn from each other. I want to thank you so much, Jordan, for coming onto this podcast. I personally learned a lot today. I'm sure that everyone listening learned a lot as well. I want to bring more and more people like Jordan. So if Jordan, you have anyone, or anyone listening to this podcast, have anyone who's been invested in unique and interesting situations where they might have seemed impossible to be investing, I would love to hear from them. People like Jordan are just incredible inspirations to me and to everyone. And thank you so much for being on here today, Jordan.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here. It's been a pleasure to watch your journey as well. I know it's lit a fire under me as well, seeing your progression. So
That's
thank you.
that's such a heartwarming thing to say. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Thank you.